Today we're going to be looking at some different watercolor techniques using the Tim Holtz Distress Reinkers. I have mine stored in the Ranger Tim Holtz palette. For this project we're also going to want some water brushes, a regular paintbrush, some sea salt, and of course some Tim Holtz watercolor cardstock. We will also want some 91% isopropyl alcohol, the Distress Mister, some Ranger clear embossing powder, some washi tape, the Distress embossing ink pad, and a stamp of your choice. For the dry brush technique, we're going to take our brush that doesn't have any water on it and we're going to dip it into some of our reinker. And then we're just going to brush that across the paper. As you can see with the dry brush, it gives us fairly decent coverage, but as the ink gets used up, we start getting this lovely wispy effect nearer the bottom of our paper. For this color, I decided to use some Twisted Citron. Okay, let's take a look at the wet on dry. For this, I'm going to grab my water brush, so the bristles of this brush are already wet. And here I'm going to grab some blueprint sketch. If you don't have these exact colors, that is completely fine. Grab any color that you like to work with. We're just looking at the technique and how different techniques work with the Tim Holtz Distress Reinker. Okay, so this is wet on dry. That means this part of the paper is still completely dry, but the brush is wet. And it lays down a very nice solid color for us, and it's fairly fluid. Next, we're going to be looking at wet on wet. So first, I'm going to take my large water brush and I'm going to lay down a layer of water without color. Then I'm going to grab my smaller water brush and I'm going to grab some wilted violet and paint over the top. As you can see, the reinker starts to move around almost immediately. So that gives us a very watery look, which is nice. Okay, next we're going to work on a fade. For this, I'm going to grab some picked raspberry and dip my water brush into it. Now I'm going to start over here and we're going to see how much of a fade I can get between this side of the paper and the other side. So this side, the ink is going to be very condensed, and as we scribble this out, our color is going to start to lighten. The great thing about reinkers is that a little bit goes a long way. And I'm going to continue that fade down here. Just one teeny tiny drop and we get lots of color. Next, we're going to do a gradient wash. First, I'm going to put down a layer of some water. Then I'm going to grab my color. For this, I'm going to be using some candied apple. And I'm going to brush the color across the top, and then we'll slowly fade it out to the bottom. Very similar to the fade, but we wet the paper completely first, unlike with the fade where we just went straight in with the brush. And if you want something darker, you can always go back and dip your ink again and add more color. And the same, if you don't like the bottom part, well, we just wipe off our brush and then we can use the water to fade this out. So I can actually lift a little bit of this and fade that even more. There. Now we're going to do a varied gradient. For this, I'm going to use 3 colors to get a blend. And again, I am going to wet the paper with my water brush first. Now I'm going to start with my darkest color. I've got some picked raspberry that we're going to put down first. That is going to fade into some of the candied apple. And the candied apple is then going to fade into some carved pumpkin. Great. Now let's go up top and we're going to look at the bleed and bloom technique. For this, I'm going to wet the page with my water brush first, and we're going to put down some of the Mermaid Lagoon. Next, I'm going to add in some wilted violet, and we're just going to gently dab this in at the corners and watch as the 2 colors bleed and mix together. There we go. The more water we add in this case, the better a bleed and bloom we will get. You can see the water traveling the color out from where we first put it down. Okay, so that would be bleed and bloom. Then we're going to take a look at masking. I put down a couple of strips of some Tim Holtz washi tape, and now we're just going to add some color over the top. The washi tape is going to act as a resist, and the parts underneath will remain white while we add color over the top. So I'm going to start with some evergreen bough. Have to move quickly. It looks like it might bleed a little bit under the tape in a couple of areas. Then we'll grab some salty ocean. And a little bit of blueprint sketch. Okay, that looks good. So I'm just going to mute this for a second while I turn on my heat tool to make sure that all of this lovely color is dry before we remove the tape. Okay, now that this is dry, let's take the tape off and see how it looks. Not bad, we got a fairly decent mask, though I do see we drip just a little bit in the corner. Now we're going to do one of my favorite techniques. We're going to be doing watercolor with salt. I'm going to start with some Mermaid Lagoon. Just get that down on the paper. And then I'm going to bleed that into some squeezed lemonade. Now, I have some sea salt, and we're going to just sprinkle the sea salt onto our paper. And we'll come back later to see what it's done. Now we're going to take a look at embossing resist. For the embossing resist technique, I used the apple from the Tim Holtz Schoolhouse mini stamp set. I stamped with Distress embossing ink and sprinkled it with the Ranger clear embossing powder and heat set it. Now we're going to go in and take some color and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to go in with some candied apple first. You can already see the nice lovely resist going on. And then I'm going to go in with some Lucky Clover. And last, I will fill in the edges with some speckled egg. And now we can see the clear print of the apple. The embossing powder helped resist so that we could have a nice, clear, crisp image underneath all of our watercolor. Next, we're going to move down here and we're going to do a technique using water drops. Pretty similar technique to what you might see if you were doing a blend with ink pads, but it looks just as good with watercolor. So I'm going to start with some mustard seed. And we'll bleed that into some carved pumpkin. Okay. Now, two ways we could do this. One, we could drop water droplets with a paintbrush, or we could go in with our Distress sprayer. So, squeezing the trigger very lightly, I'm going to drop a few drops on here. Okay. Now I'll just let that set and we'll come back and look at that after. Next, we're going to look at alcohol drips. That's going to be an interesting comparison between the water droplets. All right, so to start with, I'm going to grab some wilted violet. And then I'm going to grab some picked raspberry. Okay, now we're going to take our small bottle and drop some isopropyl alcohol onto our page. Oh, that's interesting. It looks like it might be bleaching this a little bit. It's very subtle, but it appears that the rubbing alcohol is bleaching out our color just a little bit in areas. Very interesting. I definitely notice it more on the purple where we're getting just a little bit of discoloration. That purple is becoming more of a blue since the rubbing alcohol was added. Neat. Okay, Now let's take a look at our last technique with the sea salt. So I'm just removing my corners here, and we're going to brush the sea salt off and see what happened. As you can see, the sea salt left behind some interesting texture. And there we have it, 12 different techniques for watercoloring with Tim Holtz Distress Reinkers. I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial with different watercolor techniques. So, until next time, happy crafting!